like, and make sure to engage in comments and share this video to your friends and story lovers, and click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mort Effects for more real horror stories like this. It started the week before Christmas, just as the air grew sharp and cold and the street lights flickered on earlier than usual. I wasn't supposed to be home alone. My mom and little sister had packed their bags and left 2 days ago to spend the holidays with my aunt in another state. I was meant to join them, but work had me tied up, and by the time I realized I could actually take the time off, plane tickets were too expensive. So here I was, alone in our family home, a modest little house tucked into the corner of a quiet neighborhood. The first time I noticed him, I didn't think much of it. Mr. Wendell, the old man next door, was a familiar face in the neighborhood. He lived alone in the sagging, ivy-covered house that looked like it hadn't been touched since the 70s. Growing up, I never saw him do much besides mow his lawn or pick up the newspaper in his frayed plaid robe. He was just there, part of the scenery, like the rusty mailboxes and the cracked sidewalks. But now, being home alone, I started to notice more. That first night, I was sitting in the living room scrolling through my phone when I glanced out the window. There he was, standing on the sidewalk in front of his house. Not doing anything, just standing there, motionless. His pale face illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlight. His eyes seemed to be fixed on something, but I couldn't tell what. I told myself it was nothing. He was an old man. Maybe he was taking a break during a late-night stroll. Still, it made me uncomfortable. The next day, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. It's easy to let your mind play tricks on you when you're alone in a quiet house. I went about my day, running errands and catching up on work. By the time I got home, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, and the shadows in the neighborhood grew longer. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw him again. This time, he was standing in his front yard, just a few feet from the edge of my property. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching. I locked the car door and walked briskly into the house, my keys jingling in my hand. Once inside, I peeked out the window, but he was gone. I tried to brush it off, but a nagging feeling crept into my chest. Why was he always outside at night? Why did he seem to show up when I was coming or going? I tried to distract myself with TV, but every creak of the house, every rustle outside, made my stomach tighten. That night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, like the scraping of something heavy against the pavement. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I listened closely, and there it was again, closer this time. My mind raced with possibilities. A raccoon, a stray cat, maybe even the wind. But something about it didn't feel natural. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Mr. Wendell was standing on the sidewalk directly in front of my house. He wasn't looking at my window, but his head was tilted slightly, as if he were listening for something. In his hand, he held what looked like a long walking stick, the end of it scraping lightly against the pavement as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I ducked away from the window and sat on the floor, my breathing shallow. I told myself I was overreacting. He was harmless, just an old man, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, I decided to confront him. Maybe a polite conversation would ease my nerves. I waited until I saw him on his porch, sipping from a mug. I stepped outside and called out, "Good morning, Mr. Wendell." He turned slowly, his face devoid of expression. "Morning," he replied, his voice low and gravelly. I forced a smile. "I noticed you've been out and about a lot lately. Everything okay?" For a moment, he didn't respond. He just stared at me, his pale blue eyes unblinking. Then he said, "You should be careful. The nights aren't as quiet as they seem." Before I could respond, he turned and went back into his house, leaving me standing there, confused and uneasy. By the time night fell again, my unease had grown into full-blown anxiety. I locked every door and window, double-checking each one before retreating to my room. But even behind a locked door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it again. That scraping sound, this time right outside my bedroom window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The scraping noise was slow, deliberate, like someone dragging a heavy stick across the sidewalk. But it wasn't on the sidewalk anymore. It was too close, right under my window. My bedroom was on the ground floor, and the thought of someone standing just inches away from me, separated only by a thin pane of glass, made my skin crawl. I wanted to look, but fear kept me rooted to the bed. What if I saw him? What if he saw me? The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then came a soft tap. Not a knock, but a single, deliberate tap on the window. My stomach flipped. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I turned on the flashlight. The weak beam of light quivered as I shone it toward the window, but I couldn't see anything beyond the curtain. The tapping didn't come again, but I swear I could feel someone, or something, just standing there, watching. I barely slept that night. When the sun finally came up, I forced myself to check outside. There was nothing unusual, no footprints in the dirt under the window, no sign that anyone had been there. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was losing it. Being alone in a quiet house can do that to you. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew better. That day, I stayed out of the house as much as I could. I went to the gym, grabbed coffee, drove aimlessly around the city, anything to avoid going home, but eventually I had to. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was setting, and a familiar sense of dread settled over me. As I got out of the car, I glanced toward Mr. Wendell's house. The curtains in one of his front windows twitched. I couldn't see him, but I knew he was there, watching. Inside, the house felt colder than usual, like someone had left a window open. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed, but nothing was out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As night fell, I sat in the living room with all the lights on, trying to distract myself with TV. But every so often, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow passing by the window, a flicker of something just outside my field of vision. Around midnight, I heard it again, the scraping sound. My heart started racing as I turned off the TV and sat in the silence, listening. The sound moved slowly around the house, from the front yard to the side, then toward the back. I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept toward the back door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. The scraping stopped, and then a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "You should be careful," it said, repeating the exact words Mr. Wendell had said to me the day before. My blood turned to ice. I stood frozen by the door, clutching the knife, trying to steady my breathing. "The nights aren't as quiet as they seem," the voice added, this time louder, closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw open the door and stepped outside, knife in hand. "Who's there?" I shouted into the night. The yard was empty. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. I felt a mix of relief and fear. Relief that no one was there. Fear that they could be hiding, waiting. As I turned to go back inside, I noticed something on the porch. A long, thin scratch ran across the wooden planks, as if someone had dragged something sharp across it. My stomach churned as I stared at it, my mind racing with possibilities. I closed and locked the door behind me, my heart pounding. The rest of the night was a blur of sleeplessness and paranoia. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind sent my nerves into overdrive. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but determined to figure out what was going on. I decided to confront Mr. Wendell again. He had to know something. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and finally, I heard shuffling from inside. The door creaked open just a crack, and there he was, his pale face peeking out from the shadows. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and irritated. "Mr. Wendell, I don't mean to bother you, but I've been hearing things, strange things. And last night, I hesitated. How could I explain what I'd heard without sounding crazy? Last night I thought I heard someone outside my house. I was wondering if maybe you saw anything." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he opened the door a little wider and stepped out onto the porch. Up close, he looked worse than I remembered. His skin was pale and sallow, his eyes sunken, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the doorframe. "You need to leave," he said abruptly. I blinked, taken aback. "What? Why?" He looked around nervously, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. "This neighborhood isn't safe." "Not anymore. They're here." "Who's here?" I asked, my voice rising. But he didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back inside and shut the door in my face, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. That night, I stayed up late, my mind replaying his words over and over. Who was they? And why wasn't the neighborhood safe? I didn't have any answers, but I knew one thing for sure. Something was very, very wrong. That night, I decided to stay in the living room. If something or someone was lurking outside, I wanted to see it coming. I turned off all the lights except for a small lamp and kept the knife from the kitchen on the coffee table in front of me. My phone was fully charged, ready to call for help at the first sign of trouble. But deep down, I wasn't sure help would arrive in time if something went wrong. The hours dragged by, the silence in the house pressing down on me like a weight. Every so often, I would glance at the clock. 11 o'clock p.m., midnight, 1 o'clock a.m. The later it got, the more the tension grew. I kept telling myself that nothing was going to happen, that I'd wake up the next morning feeling foolish for losing sleep over a shadow and a few strange sounds. And then, just past 2 o'clock a.m., I heard it. The scraping noise was back, louder than before, and it wasn't outside this time. It was coming from inside the house. My chest tightened as I strained to hear, my pulse thundering in my ears. The sound seemed to come from the hallway that led to the back of the house. It was slow, deliberate, and it was getting closer. I grabbed the knife, my hands slick with sweat, and stood up. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. There was no response, just the continued scrape of something dragging along the floor. I moved toward the hallway, knife raised, trying to keep my breathing steady. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the lamp in the living room. As I stepped into the hallway, the sound stopped. The silence was deafening, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, quick and fleeting, darted across the end of the hallway. I whipped around, my heart pounding. "Show yourself," I shouted, the knife shaking in my hand. But the shadow was gone. The hallway was empty. I turned back toward the living room and froze. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Wendell. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were wide and unblinking. He was holding that same long walking stick I'd seen before, the end of it scuffed and worn. "I told you," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They're here." "Who's here?" I demanded, taking a step back. "How did you get in?" Before he could answer, there was a loud crash from the back of the house. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the hallway, and both of us turned toward the noise. "It's too late," Mr. Wendell muttered, more to himself than to me. "They've found you." "What are you talking about? Who's after me?" I yelled, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and started walking toward the back of the house, his movements stiff and mechanical. I followed him, fear and adrenaline coursing through me. The kitchen was in shambles. The back window shattered, shards of glass glinting in the moonlight. The back door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. And then I saw them. Two figures stood just outside the door, their silhouettes barely visible in the darkness. They were tall and thin, their limbs impossibly long, and their faces, I couldn't make out their features, but something about them was wrong. They didn't move like people. They jerked and twitched, their heads cocking unnaturally to the side as if they were studying me. "Don't look at them," Mr. Wendell hissed, grabbing my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone his age. "Once they know you've seen them, they won't stop." "What do you mean?" I asked, panic rising in my voice. "What are they?" "They're not human," he whispered, pulling me away from the door. "They've been watching you, waiting. I tried to warn you, but you didn't listen." The figures took a step closer, their movements unnervingly slow and deliberate. My mind raced. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen in real life. But the fear in Mr. Wendell's voice, the way the air seemed to grow colder with every passing second, it all felt too real. "We have to leave," Mr. Wendell said, dragging me toward the front door. Now. Before we could take another step, one of the figures let out a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't a growl or a scream. It was something inhuman, a sound I couldn't even begin to describe. The other figure lunged forward, its impossibly long arm reaching through the broken window. I screamed, stumbling backward as the hand grasped at the air, its fingers long and thin like tree branches. "Run!" Mr. Wendell shouted, shoving me toward the front of the house. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted down the hallway, the sound of shuffling footsteps, and that terrible, guttural noise following close behind. My only thought was to get out, to get as far away as possible. But as I reached the front door and yanked it open, I froze. Standing on the porch, silhouetted against the faint glow of the streetlight, was another figure. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its empty, hollow eyes seemed to lock onto mine. Behind me, I could hear the others closing in, their movements faster now, more frantic. I was trapped, and that's when I realized the sound wasn't just coming from the back of the house anymore. It was coming from above me, from the walls, from everywhere. They were inside. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mortifacts for more real and true stories like this.